The Cuban Revolution was an armed revolt conducted by Fidel Castro's 26th of July movement and its allies against the U.S.-backed authoritarian government of Cuban President Fulgencio Batista. The revolution began in July 1953, and continued sporadically until the rebels finally ousted Batista on 1 January 1959, replacing his government with a revolutionary socialist state. The 26th of July movement later reformed along communist lines, becoming the Communist Party in October 1965. The Communist Party, now headed by Castro's brother Raúl, continues to govern Cuba today. The Cuban Revolution had powerful domestic and international repercussions. In particular, it reshaped Cuba's relationship with the United States, which still maintains a trade embargo against Cuba as of 2016. Although efforts to improve diplomatic relations have gained momentum in recent years, in the immediate aftermath of the revolution, Castro's government began a program of nationalization and political consolidation that transformed Cuba's economy and civil society. The revolution also heralded an era of Cuban intervention in foreign military conflicts, including the Angolan Civil War and the Nicaraguan Revolution. Background and causes. In the decades following its independence from Spain in 1902, Cuba experienced a period of significant instability, enduring a number of revolts, coups and period of U.S. military intervention. Fulgencio Batista, a former soldier who had served as the elected president of Cuba from 1940 to 1944, became president for the second time in March 1952, after seizing power in a military coup and cancelling the 1952 elections. Although Batista had been a relative progressive during his first term, in the 1950s he proved far more dictatorial and indifferent to popular concerns. While Cuba remained plagued by high unemployment and limited water infrastructure, Batista antagonized the population by forming lucrative links to organized crime and allowing American companies to dominate the Cuban economy. During his first term as president, Batista had been supported by the Communist Party of Cuba, but during his second term he became strongly anti-communist, gaining him political and military support from the United States. Batista developed a powerful security infrastructure to silence political opponents. In the months following the March 1952 coup, Fidel Castro, then a young lawyer and activist, petitioned for the overthrow of Batista, whom he accused of corruption and tyranny. However, Castro's constitutional arguments were rejected by the Cuban courts. After deciding that the Cuban regime could not be replaced through legal means, Castro resolved to launch an armed revolution. To this end, he and his brother Raúl founded a paramilitary organization known as the Movement, stockpiling weapons and recruiting around 1,200 followers from Havana's disgruntled working class by the end of 1952. Early stages. To strike their first blow against the Batista government, Fidel and Raúl Castro gathered 123 movement fighters and planned a multi-pronged attack on several military installations. On 26 July 1953, the rebels attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago and the barracks in Bayamo, only to be decisively defeated by government soldiers. The exact number of rebels killed in the battle is debatable. However, in his autobiography, Fidel Castro claimed that 9 were killed in the fighting, and an additional 56 were executed after being captured by the Batista government. Among the dead was Abel Santamaria, Castro's second-in-command, who was imprisoned, tortured, and executed on the same day as the attack. Numerous key movement people, including the Castro brothers, were captured shortly afterwards. In a highly political trial, Fidel spoke for nearly 4 hours in his defense, ending with the words, "Condemn me, it does not matter. History will absolve me." Fidel was sentenced to 15 years in the Presidio Modelo prison, located on Isla de Pinos, while Raúl was sentenced to 13 years. However, in 1955, under broad political pressure, the Batista government freed all political prisoners in Cuba, including the Moncada attackers. Fidel's Jesuit childhood teachers succeeded in persuading Batista to include Fidel and Raúl in the release. Soon, the Castro brothers joined with other exiles in Mexico to prepare for the overthrow of Batista, receiving training from Alberto, a leader of Republican forces in the Spanish Civil War. In June 1955, Fidel met the Argentine revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara, who joined his cause. The revolutionaries named themselves the 26th of July movement, in reference to the date of their attack on the Moncada barracks in 1953. Guerrilla warfare. I believe that there is no country in the world, including any and all the countries under colonial domination, where economic colonization, humiliation and exploitation were worse than in Cuba, in part owing to my country's policies during the Batista regime. I approved the proclamation which Fidel Castro made in the Sierra Maestra, when he justifiably called for justice and especially yearned to rid Cuba of corruption. I will even go further. To some extent it is as though Batista was the incarnation of a number of sins on the part of the United States. Now we shall have to pay for those sins. In the matter of the Batista regime, I am in agreement with the first Cuban revolutionaries. That is perfectly clear. U.S. President John F. Kennedy, interview with Jean Daniel, the 24th of October 1963. The yacht Granma arrived in Cuba on December 2, 1956, carrying the Castro brothers and 80 others. Even though the yacht was only designed to accommodate 12 people with a maximum of 25, the boat landed in Playa Las Coloradas, in the municipality of Niquero, arriving 2 days later than planned because the boat was heavily loaded. Unlike during the practice sailing runs, this dashed any hopes for a coordinated attack with the Llano wing of the movement. After arriving and exiting the ship, the band of rebels began to make their way into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, a range in southeastern Cuba. 3 days after the trek began, Batista's army attacked and killed most of the Granma participants, while the exact number is disputed. No more than 20 of the original 82 men survived the initial encounters with the Cuban army and escaped into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. The group of survivors included Fidel and Raúl Castro, Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos. The dispersed survivors, alone or in small groups, wandered through the mountains, looking for each other. Eventually, the men would link up again, with the help of peasant sympathizers, and would form the core leadership of the guerrilla army. A number of female revolutionaries, including Celia Sanchez and Haydée Santamaria, also assisted Fidel Castro's operations in the mountains. On 13 March 1957, a separate group of revolutionaries, the Anti-Communist Student Revolutionary Directorate, composed mostly of students, stormed the presidential palace in Havana, attempting to assassinate Batista and decapitate the government. The attack ended in utter failure. The RD's leader, student José Antonio Echeverría, died in a shootout with Batista's forces at the Havana radio station he had seized to spread the news of Batista's anticipated death. The handful of survivors included Drive, Humberto Costello, Rolando Kubler and Foray Choman. Thereafter, the United States imposed an economic embargo on the Cuban government and recalled its ambassador, weakening the government's mandate further. Batista's support among Cubans began to fade, with former supporters either joining the revolutionaries or distancing themselves from Batista. Nonetheless, the mafia and U.S. businessmen maintained their support for the regime. Batista's government often resorted to brutal methods to keep Cuba's cities under control. However, in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, Castro, aided by Frank País, Ramos Lator, Huber Matos, and many others, staged successful attacks on small garrisons of Batista's troops. Che Guevara and Raúl Castro helped Fidel to consolidate his political control in the mountains, often through execution of suspected Batista loyalists or other rivals of Castro's. In addition, poorly armed irregulars known as escopeteros harassed Batista's forces in the foothills and plains of Oriente province. The escopeteros also provided direct military support to Castro's main forces by protecting supply lines and by sharing intelligence. Ultimately, the mountains came under Castro's control. In addition to armed resistance, the rebels sought to use propaganda to their advantage. A pirate radio station called Radio Rebelde was set up in February 1958, allowing Castro and his forces to broadcast their message nationwide within enemy territory. The radio broadcasts were made possible by Carlos Franqui, a previous acquaintance of Castro who subsequently became a Cuban exile in Puerto Rico. During this time, Castro's forces remained quite small in numbers, sometimes fewer than 200 men, while the Cuban army and police force had a manpower of around 37,000. Even so, nearly every time the Cuban military fought against the revolutionaries, the army was forced to retreat. An arms embargo, imposed on the Cuban government by the United States on 14 March 1958, contributed significantly to the weakness of Batista's forces. The Cuban Air Force rapidly deteriorated. It could not repair its airplanes without importing parts from the United States. Batista finally responded to Castro's efforts with an attack on the mountains called Operation Verano, known to the rebels as La Ofensiva. The army sent some 12,000 soldiers, half of them untrained recruits, into the mountains. In a series of small skirmishes, Castro's determined guerrillas defeated the Cuban army. In the Battle of La Plata, which lasted from the 11th of July to the 21st of July 1958, Castro's forces defeated a 500-man battalion, capturing 240 men while losing just 3 of their own. However, the tide nearly turned on the 29th of July 1958. When Batista's troops almost destroyed Castro's small army of some 300 men at the Battle of Las Mercedes. With his forces pinned down by superior numbers, Castro asked for, and received, a temporary ceasefire on 1 August. Over the next 7 days, while fruitless negotiations took place, Castro's forces gradually escaped from the trap. By the 8th of August, Castro's entire army had escaped back into the mountains, and Operation Verano had effectively ended in failure for the Batista government. Final offensive and rebel victory. The enemy soldier in the Cuban example, which at present concerns us, is the junior partner of the dictator. He is the man who gets the last crumb left by a long line of profiteers that begins in Wall Street and ends with him. He is disposed to defend his privileges, but he is disposed to defend them only to the degree that they are important to him. His salary and his pension are worth some suffering and some dangers, but they are never worth his life. If the price of maintaining them will cost it, he is better off giving them up, that is to say, withdrawing from the face of the guerrilla danger. Che Guevara, 1958. On 21 August 1958, after the defeat of Batista's Ofensiva, Castro's forces began their own offensive. In the Oriente province, Fidel Castro, Raúl Castro and Juan Almeida Bosque directed attacks on 4 fronts. Descending from the mountains with new weapons captured during the Ofensiva and smuggled in by plane, Castro's forces won a series of initial victories. Castro's major victory at Geyser, and the successful capture of several towns including Mafor, Contramaestra, and Central Oriente, brought the Quarter Plains under his control. Meanwhile, 3 rebel columns, under the command of Che Guevara, Camilo Cienfuegos and Jaime Vega, proceeded westward towards Santa Clara, the capital of Villa Clara province. Batista's forces ambushed and destroyed Jaime Vega's column, but the surviving 2 columns reached the central provinces, where they joined forces with several other resistance groups not under the command of Castro. When Che Guevara's column passed through the province of Las Villas, and specifically through the Escambray Mountains, where the anti-communist Revolutionary Directorate forces had been fighting Batista's army for many months, friction developed between the two groups of rebels. Nonetheless, the combined rebel army continued the offensive, and Cienfuegos won a key victory in the Battle of Yaguajay on 30 December 1958. Earning him the nickname, the Hero of Yaguajay. On 31 December 1958, the Battle of Santa Clara took place in a scene of great confusion. The city of Santa Clara fell to the combined forces of Che Guevara, Cienfuegos, and Revolutionary Directorate rebels led by Comandantes Rolando Kubler, Juan Abrahantes, and William Alexander Morgan. News of these defeats caused Batista to panic. He fled Cuba by air for the Dominican Republic just hours later on 1 January 1959. Comandante William Alexander Morgan, leading road rebel forces, continued fighting as Batista departed, and had captured the city of Cienfuegos by 2 January. Castro learned of Batista's flight in the morning and immediately started negotiations to take over Santiago de Cuba. On 2 January, the military commander in the city, Colonel Rubido, ordered his soldiers not to fight, and Castro's forces took over the city. The forces of Guevara and Cienfuegos entered Havana at about the same time. They had met no opposition on their journey from Santa Clara to Cuba's capital. Castro himself arrived in Havana on 8 January after a long victory march. His initial choice of President, Manuel Urrutia El Elio, took office on 3 January.